All right, let's get started for the evening. I know it's probably going to be a lively conversation and hopefully a lively Q&A. So I want to get us off to start the event. Welcome everyone to this evening's discussion between Fournier and Pamila Matharu. A quick few housekeeping notes. This is our second last event of the MVS Proseminar series this year. Next week, we have Rui Amaral, adjunct curator of MoCA, also speaking, same time at 5:30. So please come back and listen to him speak about his curatorial practice. I'm going to keep the rest of the intro very short tonight. Basically, I want to thank our partners right off the bat, Type Books here in Toronto and MIT Press, the publisher of the book. So we've partnered with both of these, obviously the publisher of the book for obvious reasons, but also Type, where it's been a great local bookstore in Toronto that we really encourage you to order from. We'll be putting a link in the chat session of today's talk, so you can click on it and order it from them. So again, they're a great supporter of a lot of the publications we do at Daniels, and it's really great that they're here in Toronto. So we want to drive as much support as possible. We're gonna be doing different land acknowledgements depending on different places that people are at. So we're gonna jump right into the bios to start with. So Lorraine Fournier is a writer, curator, filmmaker, and a settler who writes auto theories and auto fictions for the page and the screen. She currently is a Shirk postdoctoral fellow in visual studies, where she is working with Lisa Steele on a studio-based project that extends an auto-theoretical approach to critical considerations of whiteness, settler colonialisms, and class. She has co-edited a special issue of the ASP Journal on Autotheory with her collaborator, Alex Brostoff, which will be launched at UC Berkeley in May. Her first two books, an academic monograph through MIT Press and an auto-fictional novel through Fiction Advocate, are forthcoming in winter and spring 2021. One of the reasons why we're here today is the first book launch of that book, exactly. So very excited about that. She's invited in conversation today, Pamila Matharu, which again is a great guest, and we're all excited to be hearing from this evening. She's a settler of Northern Indian Punjabi descent, born in Birmingham, England, based in Toronto, a graduate of the Visual Arts and Fine Arts BA Ed program from York University. She works primarily in visual arts, alternative education, and cultural production. A recipient of Toronto, Ontario, and Canada Art Council Creation Production Grants, she has screened and exhibited her work locally, regionally, and nationally. Recently, she was awarded the Contact Photo Images 2020 Bertinsky Photo Book Award, the 2019 Images Festival Homebrew Award, and the 2019 Ontario Association of Art Galleries Exhibition of the Year for her critically acclaimed first solo exhibit, One of These Things Is Not Like the Other, a Space Gallery Toronto, which was I remember that show as a great show. She's been a volunteer board member for CARFAC Ontario, Gallery 44, Toronto Artscape, Images Festival, SAVAC, or Southern Asian Visual Arts Center, for those that don't know that acronym. Currently in research and development is Where Were You in 1992? Sorry, I forgot about the 19 now. Where were you in 92? Question mark. A new project slated to debut in October 2021 at the Archives of Ontario, an imitation by archive, counter archive. Iterations will continue to unfold at the Orr Gallery in Vancouver, BC, and the Agnes Etherington Center in Kingston, Ontario, through the spring and the summer of 2022, respectively. So I want to thank both of our participants this night for taking the time to engage in the conversation, and I'm really excited to hear about the book and about each other's practices and the conversation about how those two relate. So let me pass that off to Lorraine.
Yeah, thanks everybody for being here, and to Pamela. I'm excited to, as you put it, jam today. So I'm speaking to you today as a white settler on unceded territories specifically the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations on what some now call Vancouver. And I'm aware that acknowledging this land is by no means an end in itself. It is merely an acknowledgement, and that there, a lot of work remains to be done to cultivate truly decolonial and conciliatory relationships with this land.
And I thank you, Lauren, for this invitation. But more importantly, I acknowledge that I'm hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas, of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. I also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Chi-miigwech.
So the way we're going to structure this tonight is I'm going to open with a bit of a reading from the conclusion to this book. So here's the book. Yay. And yeah, so this essentially, this is the opening of the conclusion entitled Autotheory in Decolonial Times. And I'm writing through an anecdote of my experience at a conference also here in so-called Vancouver back in 2019. And I use this as a segue to start reflecting on the politics of not only auto-theoretical and auto-fictional ways of working, but also the, what is possible and impossible with this thing called theory. And then after that, Pamela and I will be speaking, so together. All right. So, quote, "This paper is rooted in a very specific embodiment," end quote. David Cherrington was speaking with a certain softness into the lapel mic on his button-down shirt. A Black man of the Caribbean diaspora living in the colonized lands of Turtle Island, Cherrington has become most recognized for his fiction writing, some of which is inspired by life. His work is more directly autobiographical in recent books, such as the nonfiction I've Been Meaning to Tell You, A Letter to My Daughter from 2018. That afternoon, he was presenting a brand new work as the plenary talk at ACUTE, which is the Association of Canadian College and University Teachers of English, 2019 Congress at UBC. The title of his presentation was Theory, a Footnote. The embodiment to which David was referring was his own, an embodiment that he transmutes through the utterances of this barely fictionalized story. It is the story of a young man with David Cherrington's name. Quote, "It's autofiction, but Cherrington conceded after the audience burst into sympathetic, knowing laughter when he referred to Y University, an institution he described as the more radical Toronto University located in the suburbs on the margins of the city. Cherrington related how he was able to attend Y University as a first-generation student from a working-class Black family in Scarborough, and how Y University, or York, to which he was so clearly referring, however disingenuinely fictionalized, was the more accessible university when it came to race and class, in his view. It was also, as he noted, a school known for its interest and innovation in this thing called theory. Quote, "Y has a reputation for being strong in something called theory," he wrote. Both were reasons why I myself had chosen Y University to pursue my PhD research, coming to my studies as a first-generation student from a working-class white settler family with mixed heritage, who from the first undergraduate course that I took in literary theory would continue to gravitate toward this weird thing called theory. Y University stood in contrast to the University of Toronto, which represented a more evidently colonial old money institution located as it was on prime downtown real estate. Of course, though, all of these universities were colonial moneyed institutions and white institutions to varying degrees. Within those spaces, Cherrington's character David is not able to articulate the conditions of that embodiment. Cherrington doesn't use those words, white or colonial, exactly. His presentation was more classically literary in its nuance, with his convincing practice of showing and not telling through narrative, character, and diction. The impetus behind Cherrington's new work was Dion Brand's novel Theory from 2018, a book that engages ideas of the autotheoretical in a novelistic, fictional narrative about the relationship between love and intellectual life. Cherrington had written his dissertation on Brand and other writers in what would become recognized as the first work in a nascent field called Black Canadian literature. Mirroring Brand's theory, which follows a character struggling to finish writing their PhD dissertation, Cherriandi's theory of footnote is an auto-theoretical response to Brand's work, to which I am, in a sense, providing my own auto-theoretical response here. Cherriandi's talk, seen as a very long footnote, was its own cohesive work of literature, a piece of writing I would suggest is best described as auto-theory, even though Cherriandi used the more common term auto-fiction. I preferred auto-theory in relation to this recent performance of Cherriandi's because it got at the fact that he, by working in ways that are autobiographical and self-reflective, addresses problems related to theory, theoretical discourse, and its frameworks, as well as the politics and aesthetics of that theory as it is practiced and circulated in and around academic spaces, and as it effects and affects extra academic life. When Cherriandi concluded his presentation, reading his new text for a precise 60 minutes, the room uproared into a standing ovation. People around me were moved, tears welling up in their eyes, and I too was nearly moved to tears, holding back a well of sadness I'd felt since I landed back on the West Coast, this strange city of Vancouver with its reverberant isolation, its depth of sadness like a tide that ebbs in and out on the costly shores of the Spanish banks. Here we were sitting on the unceded colonized ancestral lands of the Musqueam peoples at the University of British Columbia, a school I dreamed of attending when I graduated from high school at the top of my class, winner of numerous awards, but from which I was socioeconomically barred. Later, I had the opportunity to move out this way to do my master's degree, not at UBC, but in a funded program at SFU, similarly the more experimental university with the same concrete brutalism of York. I have a, so I'm just going to, actually, so I have a memory of, okay, sorry. So at SFU was where I actually worked with Cherriandi as a teaching assistant in his first year undergraduate course on post-colonialism and fiction. I have a memory of David taking us all as teaching assistants out for a delicious dinner at a restaurant in a picturesque area of the lower Burnaby Mountain. It was the end of the class, all our grades were in, and David was treating us to dinner. The memory stuck with me as I had never felt that kind of respect or integrity in the teaching assistant role. And he paid for all of us. I felt the sense that I should feel shame for being so crass about money. I knew that I probably thought about money more than many of my fellow grad students, and that my working class roots showed when I named the cost of things or named my own income without the waspy middle class reservations of some of my friends. Earlier that semester, an English professor had made an offhand comment about how, quote, you don't want to end up bagging groceries your whole life, to which the small audience of our graduate seminar laughed in knowing acknowledgement. Yes, it would really suck to bag groceries for the rest of your life. I thought of my kind and hardworking dad who had been bagging groceries and stocking shelves for over 30 years, a frontline job he got when he was 16 and which he worked at diligently until retirement. He always held firm and taught me that no job is superior to another job, just as no person is superior to another person. It was an ethics my parents fervently upheld and practiced, uneducated as they might be. The narrative of Theory of Footnote follows the protagonist David Cherriandi as he navigates the intensity of the life-sucking demands of moving up the academic ladder, with a rigorous schedule that becomes self-violent, along with his non-university educated parents and brother. The character of David's brother invokes the most profound pathos in this narrative. Despite his sharp, sparkling intellect and keen capacity for reading philosophy and theory, the most comic but also ultimately the most gutting scene involves the brother on break from his job as a security guard in Toronto's financial district, giving an almost bafflingly cogent and insightful take on Kant. In that moment, privileges come to light. Who is given access to reading and study? Who is given access to reading and study as a job, even a precarious one, in the case of a decently funded graduate student? The question is raised whether the brother is a philosophy scholar, in a sense, or a philosopher in his own right, even if he has never been affiliated with a university or formal philosophy education. David's character experiences a nauseating anger and frustration in this moment, which leads him in the climactic scene to run to the bathroom of the cafe and vomit. As if the scene could get could not get more humiliating, it concludes with the two men being escorted out of the cafe by the police. The reason? They were sitting at the table without having ordered anything, distracted by the deep conversation they were in, and told they could never return. They are both, we know, young Black men. And they are both, we understand, as Cherrington reads, thoughtful philosophers struggling with the material, political, economic, and structural realities at the end of the 20th century. And just in closing this section here, in his paper, Cherrington quotes Christina Sharp, who warns that, quote, for Black academics to produce legible work in the academy often means adhering to research methods that are drafted into the service of a larger destructive force, thereby doing violence to our own capacities to read, think, and imagine otherwise. Cherrington's character also considers the lure or powers of discourse, understood as the means through which we are hailed into an institution, with him invoking this Althusserian notion of interpolation without reference to the French philosopher who murdered his wife by strangulation. There is a violence to discourse, yes, and it's a violence many are aware of. It's a violence that can exclude, as in the case of Cherrington's brother, and it's a violence that can suppress and suffocate those who are seemingly included, as in the case of David Cherrington's character. David successfully navigates graduate school until he reaches the dissertation proposal phase and has his first very clear moment of reckoning academic discourse and institutional guidelines with his research and lived experience as a Black Canadian man and his interest in Black Canadian literature and life. And so I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit here just to close with a quote. So I'm skipping a couple of pages. Following his discussion of representations of Black masculinity in academia and the self-immolation required to be sufficiently rigorous, Cherrington proffers a definition of theory as typically understood. This definition is written as if to his younger self, explaining the racial dimensions of this so-called elevated discourse and addressing with a honed incisiveness similar to Goth Shakira's memes, the unsettling politics of opacity. And then this is a quote that from David's talk. Theory, real theory, would appear to be white, although increasingly it can be liberally applied to the non-white, thus affording the raw cultural cash crops of darkness precious opportunities of explication and refinement. Of course, of late, there have been nods among real theorists to certain so-named post-colonialists, especially those whose writings are agreeably opaque, itself a high indication of theoretical sophistication, like being an asshole or having a penis, end quote. And with these words, Cherrington addresses one of the problems at the heart of the auto-theoretical turn. What constitutes real theory? Why has theory historically been the purview of white people, and what does this mean for the possibility of decolonizing it? Why is the realness of theory predicated on its opacity or, lack of transparency? Why could the way of practicing real theory be summed up in the word asshole? And why was this joke so resonant with the academic audience listening and laughing? Weren't we the ones teaching and reinscribing this theory? And couldn't we change it if we really wanted? Thank you.
So this book's available at Type Books, just first reminder.
Thanks, Pamela.
Well, I'm here for the shameless plugs.
I appreciate
wow.
that.
I know before you ended off on that passage, you were referencing brother, and I couldn't help but think of brother when you were explaining his family situation and whatnot. And I highly, highly recommend it. I think it's been optioned for a film project now, which is amazing. And bravo, David. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
So, hi, Lauren.
Hello. Let's get into it.
Let's do it. Auto theory versus autoethnography, autobiography, auto-theoretical lens. I was really definitely not on your bandwagon a month or two ago before you contacted me. And I was like, but I don't use the word auto theory, but I've been doing it. I've been doing me. And you're like, yeah, that's why I want to jam with you. Well, I mean, you didn't use those words, but yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked a bit about this, but I think I came to you initially thinking that, you're someone who I see your practice as being, engaged with these ideas from, the context of both an artist and curator in like feminist spaces today, but then working in ways that are auto-informed, is it auto-ethnography? Is it auto-theory? Is it auto-fiction? Like, I feel like these terms, I know we're going to talk a little bit about it, there's definitely a lot of overlap and convergence. Each of them do have unique histories. So I know my book specifically is trying to trace the history of the specific term auto theory and like the relation between a kind of like autobiographic practice and theorizing and philosophizing. But autoethnography surely is doing similar work in, engendering knowledge through that like reflective auto-based work. But I saw you as someone who might provide, fresh take. I was very curious because I'm like, you're not like, as you said, on the bandwagon or identifying with this term necessarily, nor do you have to, but.
Yeah. And I think when we were talking in the last couple of conversations, I was giving you my, in terms of how I got here. So I'm going to try a Fred Moten on you. How did you get here?
How did I get here? Yeah. I mean, I love that you're asking that question because it's actually a question that I've been getting my students to ask. I've been asking my students.
How did
I
you
haven't responded myself.
Yeah, because, inquiring minds want to know.
Yeah, good public education. I feel like public education matters. Our teachers matter. Pamela, looking at you. Social funding structures. Public funding.
Oh no, I meant about auto theory.
But then, I mean, auto theory is like,
it's part of that narrative.
Really, yeah, it's part of that narrative. I mean, so I first was working in autoethnography when I was here doing my master's and kind of performative autoethnography. And it's really interesting to see the different kinds of language that emerges when we're in these academic spaces.
I wanted to draw out of you, actually.
Because it's like, like what is kind of, and I mean, you and I know we're kind of resisting, discursive like fashionability and trendiness, because I feel like as soon as something's seen as a trend, and I know with my cover I'm deliberately trying to kind of riff on that.
Check work. Sona, if Sona Safi's out there, love the project. Yeah. But
it's kind of like, I feel like as soon as something becomes seen as a trend and part of this treadmill of ideas, it's like academia at its worst because it just becomes part of that capitalist kind of treadmill. So I don't necessarily, So, starting with autoethnography, kind of performance, writing about performance, the performativity of everyday life. And when I was in the dissertation at York, I guess I was really interested in like embodied approaches to writing, what is the relationship between like the body and the text. But I was finding that a lot of the writers and artists I was gravitating toward were folks who tend to slip through the cracks of genre and medium and like who didn't necessarily fit easily into other. So,
those names?
Yeah, I mean, like I think of folks like, even people like Kathy Acker, who's like kind of in this book, but not big time, but like who, writers who, Gloria Ianzaldua, folks who kind of at the end of the 20th century were like working in ways that, maybe they were artists who had a writing practice, or they were writers who kind of came to a visual practice or a performance-based practice and were always working in between and like in between genre, and who tended to incorporate their body or self or the personal into their work.
And you unabashedly like just read about your class experience, and I tip my hat off to you, because I don't think this is a field that really is comfortable around those things. And it was really like, it felt incredibly authentic around hearing your first person experience around that. And I resonated, and I resonated with it as someone who's not white, but it was more about the class experience. So that I think was our meeting point. Like I met you in the middle around that piece. And anybody who has experienced class issues along their life and similarly, I understand what you meant around like, respecting your parents for the work ethic they've taught you and whatnot, and and, you know, saving for a rainy day and all those kind of like euphemisms our working class parents give us, but like entering academia then, and then focusing on autoethnography, autobiography, and then coming towards auto theory, like I found that, I think as much as I resisted your work in the beginning, and then I was like, because I was like, no, we're talking two different things. And in fact, I was like, wait a second, you know, the more deeper I got into it. So, you know, congrats on a lovely text, and you must feel like you've given birth. The labor that you've entailed around that piece, right? So that you're embodying that living as an art form. You know, we talked about, like, for me, it was a diet of second wave feminism, a very healthy diet of that, and coming up in third wave. And I love how you bridge, and you know, it's a transformative kind of feeling to read about, oh yeah, right, so second wave, third wave, and now here we are, and you're utilizing the current contemporary artists who are in that fourth wave. But as Jessica Yee says, we don't want waves, we want oceans of feminism, right? Who you also think through.
Yeah, just thinking of Jessica Yee not too long ago, because I remember reading their academic industrial complex of feminism in like my very first feminist book club experience, which was here at Spartacus Books.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, and I think, Pamela, it's interesting because I feel like, I'd be curious to know, you know, as we shift over thinking about like your work and my work, and it's kind of like you know, what is important about kind of like the auto in this, or like what, like the kind of the stakes and the politics of working from a kind of auto-oriented place. Because
I did tell you that, sorry, you were about to finish.
No, please go. Yeah.
Okay. I did tell you that there was only, like, you know, here I am on the week of 2 weeks before I installed, 2 years, not 2 weeks, 2 years ago, I installed that show, and I'm still talking about it. And as Charles said, like, oh, you know, you want to talk about it for like 40 years. And I don't want to talk about it for 40 years, but I'm happy that it was deemed incredibly useful in terms of the research that is being done now by our community. And I think we were talking a lot about, like, you know, in terms of where I saw myself with the 4 protagonists that I used in my show, feminists. I'm calling them feminist protagonists, or I made them feminist protagonists, and basically trying to hit in the jugular of the field of art criticism, or the larger system of art. And where the particular article that I found and was totally floored by and shocked by, that connected me to the found material that I found from that was discarded from the AGO Library and Archives, or what would have been the AGO archive. And I'm not in any, and I have said this on record, that this is not to interrogate the AGO at all. It's more about the general feeling that one gets about being part of an archive, you know, being part of art history. Karen Finlay, the artist, the contemporary artist who's based in New York, she often says that the artist is the recorder. The artist has the power to record the art history. How do you feel about that in terms of auto theory?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I mean, recording brings to mind like transcription, and I feel like there's like some of these practices, are ones of transcribing. I mean, I feel like even my kind of experience at the conference, I guess, is it a transcription or a recording? I mean, I guess it is all memoir, like you know, a recording, or you know, archival work. It's like, I guess you're recording or transcribing through your embodied memory, which you know, it's maybe subjective and precarious in its own ways. So yeah, no, I like that though. I mean, I feel like for both of us in our practices, intergenerational knowledge is so important within feminist work. And I think, you know, being able to, like have these recordings of moments in history, of previous work, being able to revisit historical pieces, and also resist this kind of, I guess, would it be like a kind of like teleological way of thinking that like we're always necessarily like a kind of like, I guess, egoism that right now we are much more ahead, or, with it in certain ways than certain feminist ancestors. I guess, yes, that might be true to some extent, that things in some ways are getting more progressive, more intersectional, like that better work is being done. But, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts too. But when I was revisiting early works by like Adrian Piper, or folks who just seem so ahead of their time in some ways, and who are working in ways that I, in retrospect, am describing as autotheoretical, to kind of understand this larger impulse across history, it's just striking to me the ways that, maybe rather than history being this kind of linear thing, it's really just that these ideas and issues and ways of working actually bubble up in different ways at different points in history.
Yeah, I mean, I found it interesting that you started with Piper, and I think the other day when we were talking, I was talking about, well, let's look at the generation of her, not at the height of her coming of age, but I'm thinking about like the Black radical women, kind of the show that was done by Rujiko Hockley, and I mentioned that to you, and it came to Albright next, as well as the Brooklyn Museum. But a lot of that work, a lot of the archiving that had happened during that time, there was no time to theorize, because Black women were just not alone in making work, but they were doing co-op before co-op was rad, right? So it was like co-op, child raising and child minding, and then people on shift works or whatnot, or if they had blue collar job or white collar jobs, and their activism came as, of course, it was the times. We have this interesting moment where we often think of 68 and the civil rights era, and why we have emblazed that year 1968 in our minds. And then I think now we'll have 2020. It's not just this global pandemic, but George Floyd. So it's like, where do the autotheoreticians fit into that? Where do the autoethnographers fit into that, right? It's going to be a unfolding of their story if they are recording their history and their time. And making one's life's work, like we were talking about the work of Audre Lorde, Black feminists, women of color feminists, the Combahee Collective, and I'm going to come back to it, but like the folks who didn't have the option to go to university, college, grad school, right? So their PhDs were done in their life's work. Their MFAs were done in their life's work, and that was
practice-based PhD. The practice-based PhD, the truly practice-based.
Before it was a trend, right? Before it became a marketing line in the university budget, So, and the lack of time they had to like take residencies or anything like that, and what did that mean around access to, at the time of their contemporary world building, right? And what did that mean? So I think, these things were what was like kind of unfolding in my head as I read. And today, just in preparation before our talk, I watched Funk Lessons.
How was that?
It was good because I danced along. And, at the end of the day, I think much to what people like, I was telling you about Tyler Mitchell's work, but, at some point you get tired of not understanding why folks want to just consume pain and not joy. So like, particularly Black pain versus Black joy. And I'm curious as to, how you felt when I was telling you how Piper took herself out of like an African American performance art show because she didn't want to be labeled as such, right? And how does that fit within the realm and the spectrum of feminist work, and practice and thinking, especially Piper, the philosophy, the Piper the philosopher.
Yeah. so much there. I wanna, like,
Sorry, I'm
take up.
piling
No,
on
it's good.
here.
I'm like making notes. We've been talking about constellating. I'm like constellating
Yeah.
of like points in that question. But
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, I think with the
Packing it in, girl. I'm packing it in.
I love it. That's how I like it. Just, excess. It's so yeah, I mean, your point about time and like this kind of idea of like a privilege of time is really interesting. And I feel like that maybe shows the need to do the kinds of work, I guess, if we can like stand behind our methodologies, that we are kind of like, revisiting moments in history, like fleshing things out. This idea, not only this is something that's come up in my classes too, like it's like who has the privileges of writing from life and lived experience and kind of theorizing in this way. On the one hand, I would say actually, anyone can, insofar as, what like our life, our body, our lived experience, we have that access, that it's expedient to us, we can work with it. Of course, then the questions of, well, who actually has the time to do the kind of work of self-reflective writing and like, research and study alongside the kind of memoiristic modes. And it's something that Marquise Bay, in his piece on lived experience is really great. And he recently published an autotheoretical book that came out after I wrote this book, so I don't include it in this book, but called Then Goon Rules on Black trans feminisms. But where he's really thinking through the kind of what it, not taking this idea of lived experience for granted, and that it is something that, who has the capacity to write from the eye, to publish work that is autobiographical and that is, without, backlash, without critique. And something I want to talk to you, and I want to come back to the other points you raised, but I don't want us to get too far away from your AGO point, because I think this ties in, is I was so struck. So for folks who don't know, so we're talking about, Pamela's, your work that you did with A-Space, then the AGO kind of institutional archival, I don't know, what do you call it, an intervention? I guess it's like a research intervention. But I was really struck.
I want to say that the Library and Archives, the EP Taylor Library and Archives staff, particularly Amy and Adrian and Marilyn, that's the librarian and the archivists. They actually were very much part of that unfolding. I didn't do anything behind their backs. They actually were part of the narrative building.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It was very collaborative, it sounds like.
Yes, it was.
Cool. Yeah, well, so there was one, document, Pamela, that you come across, the John Bentley Mays review from 1993. And I guess I just want to mention this briefly because, so basically, reviewing this, which I learned from our conversations with you, this Perspective 93 show featuring Mike Alexier and Lonnie Maestro. But just the fact that, long story short, Mays's review is essentially very, very praising of Micah's work, and even calls him the new young Rembrandt because of his self-portraits, we should add, self-portraiture. And then Lonnie Maestro is just really viciously attacked. Specifically, if I understand correctly, her work's disregarded as narcissistic. Is that? And this term narcissism is something that I had to wrestle with early on with the auto theory, because it's kind of like, okay, auto theory, I really want to like unpack both and think about the relationship and, historically. And I do turn largely to a feminist art and literary history to do that, but I'm also looking at the larger history of philosophy, beyond feminisms. Okay. But then thinking about the ways that narcissism is invoked as a way of disregarding typically work by women and women of color specifically, disregarding their work as uncritical, petty, uninteresting, non-conceptual. That's always been something that's really gotten me, is this kind of tendency to, as soon as women artists would be using their body and their work, their autobiography in direct ways, in explicit ways, not hiding the fact that it is autobiographical, that gets in the way of it being seen as legitimate in a conceptual or intellectual way. And so when I saw that, as context for your show, I was really found it compelling because, in the intro to my book, I referenced this 2014 review by David Pagel of Christine Tian Wang's work, and where she's, had a solo show in Los Angeles. And, long story short, it's disregarded as aggressively narcissistic, a heavy-handed confessional, and
that's in year 2014?
2014, yeah. And I guess what I'm trying to say, like, it's not to say, I know some of my grad students are here right now, and there was like a rift in the class in terms of, agreeing or not with that review in relation to this body of work by Wang. But I guess what really struck me is, like, the specifics of the work aside, the ways that term, the baggage of that term as being tied specifically to feminized subjects, that comes from Freud and like narcissism as this like characteristic of femininity, but then just the ways that it's invoked by typically male critics against women artists and women of color artists.
And that's what I was trying to address in the field, that there's a flawed standard. The standardization is not really accepting of anything outside of cis, white, and male. Like Christine Tien Wang's show, I still have not found it, but if you don't mind sharing it with me. But when you told me that it was 2014, I thought, wow, like, is this just the MO, of the critic? I don't know what David Pagel's background is too, because there's this kind of like misnomer of like not doing any work, absolutely no work. Like I have, like, and I told you this, and I'm going to now share with the audience, like from my K to 12 or K to OAC education, my formal education, right into university, my undergrad, it's just been, I've been just, whiteness in art history and contemporary art has just been shoved down my throat. So what would it take for someone to do a little bit of a background check with Christine Tien Wang's work, right? As well with Amrita Shergill, who I was mentioning to you in terms of what I found out through that, the overlooked obituary series in the New York Times. So, and that happened to be a new series that was started by women at the New York Times, right? Obituary writers or editors. So, and the odd question did come up 2 years ago, like, I was not at all trying to celebrate Lanny and take down Micah. I don't really know him besides saying hello on the street, but I don't know if that's still standing to say hello, but, and I don't know Lanny either. But what I was trying to address was, okay, we've got a big kettle of fish here that, like, clearly there's an issue around how we treat, basically, right? And there's no reciprocity there around how we review people who do not fit a particular mold, right? And I made the film, I was mentioning to you, the film that I made, Stuck Between an Archive and an Aesthetic, where I even drove home the point with looking at Bill T. Jones's work and how he was historically torn down by a dance critic who would refuse to go to see his work because she found out it was about surviving trauma, particularly being HIV positive. And then she decides to tear him down in 1995. I guess that was okay at the time because, of course, there's probably Republican fires going all over the place around like supporting artists with HIV status, So, at the end of the day, like I know we all also watching an industry, newspaper industry, pretty much become obsolete, and they're now transferring their skills into the online world, right? It's because it was a matter of, I'm sure, John, I know I bought the paper. I bought the Globe because of the reviews, the Saturday reviews, right? So it's like, I'm sure the art world and the folks who love the fans, all his fangirls would probably buy the paper too to read what he's saying. But the damage was done. I don't think Lanny, I don't really see her work here. But if you look at their history of the two exhibiting artists for that year for Perspective 93, both of them went to NASCAD. They're about 5 years apart in age. So in terms of experience, and Lanny is actually quite celebrated in Southeast Asia. She's represented other countries at Venice Biennale and whatnot. So she wasn't, you know what I'm saying? She wasn't a novice in any right. Like, she was skilled. She knew what she was talking about. but why are you saying that she's whiny? What does that have to do with the work? Anyways, and then that led to looking at other protagonists that I used, Lakshmi Gill and the Found Tapes, and then my underdog was Monica Diol from Electric Circus, because she was systemically, like, across the board, she was accepted by not just brown audiences, but white audiences too. Everybody loved her, right? Like, we all loved Electric Circus at the time. I'm sorry, I know I must be waxing nostalgic to you.
No, it's like good. Well, I feel like we've really been thinking about like different scenes and different subcultures and moments in time, and the kinds of like work that comes up, because I feel like, and it's something else that struck me, is how, like, okay, so like if the kinds of like personal, directly personal work is so threatening to a kind of, the hegemony of a kind of white male gaze, I guess, then it's like, where does this kind of work happen? And I think that's been what's been interesting to look back. I know you and I talked about the importance of like indie publishing and kind of small presses, specifically feminist presses, women of color presses, as being key in a lot of this early auto-theoretical work.
Yeah, and I don't know how much, like, I'm not a lit head in terms of like, or I don't teach English lit at all, so I wouldn't have done this research, but I am in close proximity of the founding publisher of Sister Vision Press here in Toronto. But on stateside, you mentioned the four presses. We're very instrumental for Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color, right? In order to get their voices out into the world, because the main presses were not at all interested in them. So we have like Kitchen Table Press, Aunt Luke Books, the two other presses that you mentioned.
South End and Firebrand.
And Firebrand, right? Mm-hmm. And here we had publications like Fireweed and whatnot. So I think we haven't really begun to even understand the impact of losing feminist presses in Canada. There was Press Gang as well, which was based in Vancouver, I think. I could be wrong. But so Women's Press as well. I don't know if they're still functioning or not, but we haven't really looked at that impact and the close proximity of writing and multidisciplinary arts and whatnot. But anyways, I want to also, writing about your like autobiographical work or auto theory is not an easy feat. So also thinking through the, putting your life into your work like this, risks, fears, notions of failure, anything cross your mind through the process?
Yeah, it's been really interesting lately where, I've been thinking about the kind of, like the stakes of people writing auto-theoretically, 80s and 90s. This is the era of like women's studies departments, these feminist presses, like critical race studies. Like you're starting to see these like academic kind of niche spaces starting to be carved out and people being able to do this work still in a fairly marginalized way. And I feel like right now, on the one hand, fairly more mainstream presses. I feel like it's presses like Grey Wolf and stuff now that tend to publish the more auto-theoretical work. Like they publish Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts, Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House, just kind of like, or Semiotext, publishing kind of Chris Krauss's work in that whole scene. But you start to see a kind of openness to auto-fictional and auto-theoretical writing in more mainstream ways. Maybe this is tied to social media technologies, ideas of us being in a kind of post-confessional era of, widespread disclosure and exposure, which, I take up at length in the book. But on the other hand, so yes, I think there's this conduciveness to like writing from a personal place, even the last kind of 2000s, 2010s, like blog culture, YouTubing, performing for the camera, all these things that these kind of embodied or subjective practices that used to be like, experimental, like are quite mainstream. And yet like a question that keeps coming up in recent months when talking about this book and kind of struck me is is, yeah, this language of danger or of risk, fear, bravery, which I don't know, I never really think of writing from life as brave, but maybe it is like, I don't know, a class thing or something where I'm like, I feel like I have less to lose or something, but I don't know. I wonder, like, because I guess there is a risk for different people to write from life.
Don't you think it's intergenerational?
Mm-hmm.
Like millennial and zennials, like you guys, sorry, I'm general, you guys, the sharing that happens online, it's incredible how much is shared. And that you bring up artists who share in that kind of non-didactic way. Is this not part of the normalcy of auto theory and the kind of terrain? I'm thinking of someone who shares that I read a lot of.
Well, we were talking, I don't know if Thursa, if you're out there, but we were talking about Thursa's posts.
It's Thursa who I was thinking of. Katan, yes.
Or Thursa Katan, yeah. And yeah, or folks who, because yeah, I mean, people have different levels of comfort. I do think it's so contextual, you know, what are you sharing, you know, to whom and how, like, of course, when we bring in the politics of like Me Too and these other questions about like libel and slander and the kind of like legalistic weight of making certain disclosures or statements publicly. And that's when you get this turn toward fictionalizing and autofiction, where there is a safety from both a legalistic standpoint in publishing, but also for some people in a kind of creative way to have that kind of veil of fictionalization to be protected by or kind of stand behind, that the work might be coming from an autobiographical place, but, you know, names have been changed, details of the stories have been changed.
Right.
And so is maybe less high stakes in that way. And I think, though, I've been so curious seeing the ways that writers like Johanna Hedva, for example, you know, these texts that would have once maybe been described as manifestos, like Sick Woman Theory, or Virginie Despence's King Kong Theory, which I read as, and she's kind of like the ex-partner of Paul B. Preciado, who wrote Testo Junkie, which was one of like the early auto theory books from 2008. But Despence's King Kong Theory is really like, when I read it, I'm like, yes, it's auto theory. It's also a manifesto to decriminalize sex work. And then so you get these pieces that are doing the work that different genres historically have done, like the manifesto, like fiction. But for whatever reason, these writers are feeling, and artists are feeling compelled to describe their work as theory. I don't know if anything struck you about that when you were reading this book, or like, you know, what we make of that. I mean, I've been thinking about the kind of different kinds of intellectual validity and, you know, legitimacy that these different terms hold. But I think also from a more just kind of fundamental place of this idea of engendering knowledge from your life and like theorizing, you know, in the sense of just reflecting on art and culture and politics and community and identity from a kind of reflective, rigorous practice of self-looking and self-reflection.
Right. I think I brought up that point the other day around, well, to me, I was thinking more along the lines of intergenerationality in my show, right? And I know you haven't seen my video, but there's a clip from a talk that Homi Baba and oh gosh, not Lenny Maestro, but from the AGO that the Library and Archives lent me, and Jamili Hassan says, and Jamili Hassan is talking to Homi Baba, and she talks about how every generation pretty much follows the same footsteps, the same path. And I mentioned that to you, and that's where I didn't want to really dip into too much around autoethnography or anything like that. In fact, I was really trying to honor these protagonists. So I use the language of ancestral wisdom as art ancestors, as I mentioned to you, on honoring ancestral wisdom. And it was about kind of, and I think that's why I liked perhaps I was drawn to your ideas around life writing, or when your section on life writing in the intro. But that to me was the space making piece, and whether it was a metaphorical space making for the elders, the elder artists, and back to our favorite word, constellation, creating a constellation. But can you think about the coexistence, the co-resistance, the affinities that you're creating with making these constellations, whether you're looking at Feminist Art Gallery, FAG, Alison Mitchell, and Deirdre Logue, whether you're looking at a younger artist like Madeleine Beckles. How are we moving forward in the genre of auto theory, regardless of our struggle with intergenerationality?
Yeah, I mean, I really loved when you were using the language of affinities and yeah, ancestral knowledge. I know you're also talking about your work as like using embodied storytelling too, and these kind of like narrativizing, narrative as a strategy or like practice.
But I wasn't saying life writing. I think you introduced me to that. Yeah.
Cool. But yeah, I mean, and this idea of building bridges and affinities makes me think of Adrian Piper's funk lessons too, that you brought up. Like, I feel like, because that's really the ethos of that work. Like, as I see it, one of many things that's happening in that work is like building bridges and affinities from a place of like joy and education, and kind of work like wrestling through, difficult conversations and histories together, but with a spirit of joy and kind of, building bridges and affinities. And yeah, I certainly see that that's what I was hoping to do and set out to do in the book is kind of connecting the dots between these different clusters and practices and figures throughout history, across different contexts, seeing what folks have in common, the different kinds of perspectives they're bringing. Maybe one way of thinking about, I guess, to your question of kind of the futurity of it, or, where are we going? That I guess I do think there's something generative in the meeting, or in the kind of, I guess we use like the language of like a dialectical kind of like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, like in bringing two things together, and seeing what happens, or even like fermentation as a metaphor, like what kind of transformations and preservations can happen when two things are brought together, or when you have a kind of mix of different influences. And the role of citation here, I feel like we haven't really invoked this term yet, but it's one that comes up a lot with auto theory. But I like how you put it when we were talking the other day, that citing, really just giving credit where credit's due. And this idea of acknowledging, yes, okay, it is this academic, maybe research-based practice that has certain genre ties to these academic forms, and yet citing as a practice is really just acknowledging where ideas have come from, where, sources of influence, sources of inspiration, and
And often I think those who migrate the margins, that's the work that tends to get lifted into the center, right? Without any citation. And I think my purpose around thinking through auto theory intergenerationally, to me, that shows that perhaps there's more of a vast landscape than we're aware of when you're bridging mainstream and alternative folks practices, right? You talk at length with of Chris Krause's I Love Dick, but then I'm thinking of someone like here on Turtle Island, like there's a Cut Hand, right? As I mentioned before. And it's not that I was doing anything new. I was reverberating, in fact, and like almost like a call and response, and I think that's what you do too, where you're connecting the dots. Yeah,
because there's a, if they're invoking, working baby dyke theory in the 90s as like this video practice alongside what Krauss is doing in the 90s. Like, there are these differences, and yet, okay, some similar ideas and threads. And I find it just really exciting to see the different kinds of approaches that these writers and artists at different points in history are taking. Because of course, we have the zeitgeist, and like there are certain ideas and practices in the zeitgeist of any given historical moment. But your point about that historically, something I've really worked to do in this book is acknowledging that, yes, this is the first book on the topic of auto theory. That's true. But this isn't brand new. Like this term actually has a much longer history. And so when Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts was published in 2015 and was being hailed as a new genre, you would start to see reviews, like I referenced Daniel Pena in his review, where he's saying, everyone's saying that Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts is this brand new thing. Well, Gloria Ianzaldúa was doing this with Borderlands La Frontera, The New Mestiza in 1987. Right. And okay, how do we actually understand? Yes, what Nelson's doing is different than what Ianzaldúa is doing, but we can start to see the ways that these different experiments inform, whether it's video art traditions, whether it's literary traditions, do come from somewhere, and it's not.
Yeah, there's definitely like this feminist psychogeography going on, I think, with the ideas too. Like, I'm thinking about, like, if we were to use an analogy of cooking, I love Italian cooking, but the thing is, like, something like how I was just watching Stanley Tucci Searching for Italy, and chef, I'm sorry, I have to.
That sounds comforting.
but the analogy of cooking, and like cooking salt cod in Venice is going to be very different how the Tuscans do it. They do it with milk, and these guys do it breaded. And so it's almost like we all understand the base foundation of it, but I think how Chris Krauss is doing it versus how Thurza's Cudhand is working through auto theory, still there's definitely a difference, and that's okay, because I think there's definitely speaks out a lot about capitalist mores and resisting market kind of forces and things like that. And also, like, in terms of giving credit where credit's due, like, if we're talking now in 2020, 2021, post George Floyd, I was talking about post 1992, the week of May 4th and the Yonge Street Uprising, as well as now we can look at it through the lens of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives mattered then, and they still matter now. And the idea there is that we have still not really understood that the history of police brutality on Black and brown lives is still alive and well. In fact, the tactics changed. The tactics have changed. But back to auto theory.
Well, yeah, I think, just as the practices are not new, the issues are not new either. Like, I think, and the 1992 uprising, it's the exact same thing. Like, but yeah, I think, well, yeah, I guess not exact. Yeah, but it is, unarmed Black men being killed by white police officers. But, this idea of the strategies changing is interesting. Like what is needed. We have like smartphones in 2020. We didn't in 1992. Or like, what are the infrastructural and contextual differences that allow us to have these different kinds of practices or responses to the issues? Yeah.
Like, and I'm thinking of something like a case of, I was also revisiting like Rodney King's, the brutal attack on Rodney King and the 4 LAPD officers that beat him up. Like it wasn't a smartphone that recorded that. It was a video camera from a house across the way. And then the person sent the tape into the local news station. So, right, pre-internet.
That's pretty amazing.
Right. And I think, but the narrative is unfortunately has not changed. Right. And it's not something that we want to stick to. We want to entangle ourselves or get ourselves out of this entanglement with misuse and abuse of power and privilege. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm maybe on a, hopefully with some optimism, like
Yeah.
I guess I'm maybe a
I was
little bit
like,
cheesy
I
and
need
sincere
to have
of like,
a happier question for you right now.
but yeah, I mean, I guess as far as, you know, the role of these kinds of auto-looking practices and auto theory and autoethnography and stuff, that I guess I really do believe there's something valuable in every person, you know, reflecting on their lived experience in a thoughtful, you know, considered, collaborative, kind of dialogic way, and that having an ethics of living, understanding that, you know, our lived experience is consequential. You know, what we do and think and say, you know, has effects, and how can we kind of like wrestle with our experiences in relation to the experiences of others. You know, I made this point to some extent when I was speaking with Mackenzie Work for the MIT Press podcast, and she was sort of like, yes, we need to be ethical subjects, but also we're living in a time where young people are like so afraid to fuck up, as she put it, and that there's actually something about, you know, the process of education and becoming an ethical subject. You know, there is space for perhaps, you know, making mistakes along the way, but I think, yeah, you know, ultimately the thing with feminism is kind of like, yeah, you almost want to put yourself out of a job, like, so to speak. Like you don't want to be doing this work forever. You know, you want the problems to go away eventually, you know, around like white supremacy and sexism and racism and misogyny and trans misogyny and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'm hopeful that at least conversations are being had in more public venues, and yeah. I wonder if we should open up to
Charles
Q&A
just sent
too.
us a note. We're at 6:40.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Yes, Charles.
Yeah, so I guess if anyone has questions for us.
Raise your hand if you're sure.
And thanks for being here with us. I know everyone's so like zoomed out. It's
pleasure.
nice to like, yeah.
Thank you everyone for being here with us. Thank you for making this book.
Thanks for reading it. Just thank yous all around.
Pamela, you also had someone in the Q&A just said thanks for giving the call out for the AGO. I don't know if you saw that because there's a couple different interfaces there, but
yeah, I can't. Okay.
Indiana Connolly from the AGO was saying thanks for giving her a call out when you were talking about her projects.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else, if folks don't have questions.
Yeah.
Anything else I missed.
I don't mind. Yeah, we're waiting. Terry Donovan. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Pamela, maybe put it back to you too. Like, do you?
Question.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We're gonna have to read this out, right? Is that what you said, Charles?
This question was in the chat, so actually everyone can see it.
Perfect. Okay.
And I mean, Logan, if he wants to say it verbally, we can also unmute, or we can all just take a moment to read it, or you can read it as you process it. I think all the options are there. It's whatever you guys want to do.
I'm happy to maybe just read it. Okay, I can read it out loud for folks.
Yes, thank you, Sona.
So here's from Logan, quote, "At the risk of being on the nose, I'd like to invoke Britney Spears here. Boomers and Gen X, during the rise of her popularity, were complicit in perpetuating the negative and horrific stereotypes that artists fell prey to. Now, in the advent of a viral documentary, millennials are eager to right the wrongs of how we objectified the singer through tabloids and an early aughts obsession with, as Madeleine Beckles proffers, quote, the Playboy hyperfemme, candy-colored Paris Hilton, that's hot aesthetic that was almost uncanny, synthetic, and real at the same time. end quote. So here we are, inundated by a world of the Hadids and the Kardashians. Can auto theory for you act as a sort of salve for history repeating itself? How does the rise of interconnectivity, including Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, problematize or ameliorate the way we objectify, criticize, observe, and accept women in popular culture? Are art, performance, and theory enough?
Wow.
That's okay. Thank you, Logan. I mean, I've certainly, I don't know if this is useful, but as someone who's coming of age, I was kind of, a teenager and preteen in the Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, that whole, and Destiny's Child and Beyonce and kind of, that I look back now and just see how hypersexualized everything was, and growing up as a woman in that age, truly just feeling like you're, only a sexual object, and that's where your value comes from. And so I mean, I don't really have anything necessarily smart to say about this because I haven't thought about it too much in a kind of philosophical sense, but from an autobiographical perspective, it's something I'm just starting to think about, because I think about the ways that, what has changed. I mean, Pamela, you work with teens, so I don't know if you have thoughts as far as, I guess is the question around, so think about intergenerationality and the idea that the kind of current generations trying to right the wrongs. I quote Anne Boyer in my book as talking about the distinction between Gen X, which she identifies, and she was like, Gen X was almost like anti-moral or like amoral, like that was what was cool. And the current like Gen Y is like hyper moral, and that there's like a kind of hyper ethics or an effort at almost innocence, like an ethical, you're above reproach. Maybe that's something there.
There's I don't want to call it a backlash, but there's definitely like a bounce back of like, I guess it was the millennial era and the Kardashians. Thank you, Logan, for, I was thinking that when I was making the comment about sharing, and I'm like, I better sound smart and talk about an artist rather than a celebrity. But yeah, I was thinking Kardashians too. It's amazing how much they've shared in there, and now they're going to have their final season. And then, thank you also for mentioning Madeleine Beckel's work, because I think she really takes the aesthetics and the kind of attributes of this era, and she made a very smart work, like, with her theory-based work, and playing with some of the notions of futurity and like where we're going from the theory, right? Because fourth wave definitely has called out second wavers around the exclusion of trans bodies, right? And non-binary folks. So there's that piece. But, I would say, I can say this much, that when I bring up Spears and Kardashians to my young people, I teach social science and visual art and media arts. And when we do look at some think pieces, they now make fun of the Kardashians. There was a time, let's say 10 years ago, when I was teaching young folks, they glorified the Kardashians. And I was like, why do you like these people? I didn't even know what the acronym for keeping up with the Kardashians was last term, and somebody put it in an essay, and I was like, what does this mean? And they're like, keeping up with the Kardashians.
It would have been lost on me too.
Yeah, exactly. But do you want to make a comment around like the inclusion of Madeleine's work in your book?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, I guess Madeleine's work features throughout the book, kind of thinking, about not only, taking up this aesthetic, but also thinking about the commodification of theory and feminisms and feminist knowledge, questions of access. And we talked about the idea of, and Colleen Smith is another artist who takes this up in this book, but the idea of having kind of practices from the margins that allow for education, like outside of graduate school and these kind of academic, industrial complexes that having, with when Beckles is like selling feminist theory in this like parodic infomercial, it's thinking about, it's reflecting and critiquing feminist theories past, and also, in a sense, not exactly perpetuating the canon, but saying, okay, if these are texts to read, you can do so. You don't necessarily need to be in graduate school paying tuition, et cetera. I think when Logan asks, can auto theory act as a kind of salve for history repeating itself? One thing I'll maybe say is that if we think about like auto theory, we've been talking a lot about the auto, but theory is part of it. And not only theory, with a capital T, or as what Luce Gray calls a kind of master discourse, which I take up and try to kind of deconstruct throughout the book, but also the idea of research and study and considered reflection. So it isn't just about, a kind of confessing and kind of just letting it all out there that makes it, that's part of it, the confession or the autobiographical reflection, but then also being able to look back at history as part of a practice of research and study broadly understood. I don't mean necessarily only happening in the context of like, institutional structures, but yeah, being able to have an awareness of history, have an awareness of where we've come from and where we're going. And because I think that I draw on like Frederick Jameson's definitions of postmodernism in the book a bit, and kind of in a kind of critiquing like capitalist sense and neo-Marxist sense, but it's like, yeah, the risks of the kind of like postmodern moment of a kind of ahistoricity, or feeling like we're kind of floating or suspended from history, and the risks of living in that way. Okay. And so maybe it is worth just, having kind of an emphasis on intergenerational knowledge and conversation.
We have 2 questions that have come in. I'm going to read them. On the subject of narcissism, this is Andrew. Is it Andrew James Patterson or Andy Patterson?
I'm assuming.
Andy Patterson.
Is this you, Andy? Yeah.
On the subject of narcissism, do we distinguish between somebody drawing on the autobiographical and somebody who is incapable of seeing issues or events in a context beyond themselves? Oh,
yeah. Andy, I'm glad you raised this, because I did want to kind of note.
Andy.
Mm-hmm. It's like so in the book, when I kind of give a little bit of a history of this term narcissism, that's just a little part of the conversation. It's just to get at the auto-oriented work is just disregarded flat out because of so-called narcissism. Thinking about the history of this term, it doesn't mean that there isn't still work that can be critiqued as narcissistic, this is the issue with the Wang work that we were taking up in the grad course, because it's like, okay, well, maybe, there are some legitimate critiques that we can make around, okay, Andy, if you're saying, this idea of narcissism in a kind of clinical DSM sense, which I can, cite here while still being critical of hegemonic psychiatric institutions. But yeah, the idea of narcissism in a kind of, sorry?
And the DSM on the whole.
Yes, exactly, and the DSM as a whole. But yes, that the idea of being incapable of actually seeing beyond yourself. As my friend Alex Brostoff, who was mentioned earlier, put it, auto theory in some senses is a misnomer, because it isn't just about the auto. That you'll actually see in a lot of this work the invoking of community, collectives, relationships, networks, that it is the self in relation to others that forms so much of this work. And so it isn't just that it's a kind of self-looking that, is ultimately fatal in the mythological story of young Narcissus who falls into the pool in love with his own image, but that there's something that actually, like, auto is part of it, but it's the self in relation with others. I don't know if Andy, Pamela, do you have other thoughts on that?
No, I think you hit it on the head. I can't really, I was thinking through Andrew's and Andy's question in terms of your text and your examples, and in terms of your illustrated work, but I don't feel that I have anything to add, but John Paul Kelly has a fairly large question.
Sorry, one more thing I'll say to Andy's point is, sorry. Oh, sorry, I missed that, Pamela.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to note that I think that you also, Andrew, are getting at part of the problem of why narcissism is invoked as a critique, because the assumption is that if the work is self-looking in any direct, obvious way, if the personal is being put forward as personal, there's this assumption that it's insular. There's this assumption that you're only seeing yourself and therefore it's not relevant, or therefore it's not, politically interesting, philosophically interesting. And so I think that's really the problem that I was addressing from a kind of feminist art historiographic perspective. But yeah, let's John Paul Kelly. So thank you both for these questions.
Does autofiction fill the potential gap for radicality that has been opened by the suspicion against aesthetic appropriation? Is the oppositional critique that has been traditionally activated by queer and BIPOC peoples through appropriation in the form of culture jamming, sampling, and found image impoverished by found image usage impoverished by the intersection of attribution against image abduction by progressive agendas and property by corporate ownership of circulated networked representations by capitalist agendas? Is autofiction a strategy that can be explored to offer an embodied form of oppositional critique? Are there ethical pitfalls, as in aesthetic appropriation, even more deeply rooted in this strategy? Does the fashionable, mandatory foregrounding of the self, including the recognition of this self as an untrustworthy narrator into representation, ask for potentially limited and disturbing form of legibility in order to be read, seen, and heard? Here, I'm thinking of Pamela's thoughts around Adrian Piper's decision to remove herself from an exhibition because of how her participation would position her work. Whoa, JP.
Okay. Thank you, JP, for that.
I mean, I can't speak for, I'm not Black, and I'm not a member of the Black community. I'm just doing it through observation. So I wonder what she would say to those thoughts. Lauren? But
yeah,
you,
I mean, I guess.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, well, to Piper's point, I know in the book I take up like the trickiness of putting language to artists' practices that resist kind of terminology and identity labels and language. So I talk about this with Thurza's work, and Thurza, if you're out there, hello. The shifting like lesbian, two-spirit, boy, BOI, kind of queer, back to lesbian, like kind of like the fluidity of identity, or Piper's work. Kind of ambivalent relationship both to Blackness and whiteness, and kind of the in-between spaces. So I certainly took that into consideration in my approach to writing, and kind of just using more fluid language when I'm referring to these artists. But JP, to your question about when you say, are there ethical pitfalls rooted in the strategy, does the foregrounding of the self ask for, okay, so one thing I'll note, so Chris Kraus comes to mind. So Chris Kraus, her critique in the end of the 90s is basically, as she puts it, most novels, most fiction by like white men is actually, as she puts it, a thinly veiled story of me. And she puts story of me in all caps. And it's this idea that, so much of what is ostensibly fiction, and this is leaving aside the whole rich history of autofiction, which JP, tied to, typically seen as being tied to a French literary canon, mainly French queer gay men like Hervé Guibert, Serge Dubrovsky. Hervé Guibert's work is starting to be given more space in the autofictional conversation because it's been recently translated, but he wrote the book to the Friend Who Did Not Save My Life in 1990. And this is the book that famously outed Michel Foucault, but was also an autofictional, autotheoretical, memoiristic piece about Guibert's experience living with HIV and AIDS, and ultimately dying, from which he ultimately died. And I think what Kraus was kind of calling out in this like 90s post-punk white feminist auto theory was that that many men have historically hidden behind fiction while actually writing from life. So she cites Paul Auster, who in one of his books has a character that's very, very clearly Sophie Calle, and has these kind of vaguely fictionalized versions of Sophie Calle's conceptual artworks. But then Krauss, from a literary criticism perspective, is like, you know, you get the kind of protagonist as the hero or the anti-hero who's fully fleshed out based on Paul Auster himself, arguably. And then you have just this kind of cast of supporting characters, many of whom are underdeveloped or kind of caricatures in the case of, that was Krauss's reading of Auster's treatment of the Sophie Calle character. So I think with my auto theory book, really just trying to, not necessarily autofiction's in the periphery and it's always there, because I think there tends to be a shuttling between the theory and the fiction. And, but then thinking about the stakes from Chris Krauss's perspective, for example, the stakes of writing in a way that is autobiographic without using a disingenuous form of fictionalization, which she sees as disingenuous and as ultimately perhaps not aesthetically or politically useful. That for her, and then of course she then parodies that in a kind of meta-theoretical way in Isle of Dick, because then you get the character Chris Krauss and the character Sylvain L'Étranger. And of course, it's basically just speaking from life, but in the third person. I don't know, JP, is that answering your question at all? I'm not sure if we did that justice. Let me see.
You happy, JP?
Or if you want to have any follow-up points. But I think the ethical pitfalls, certainly, I mean, the ethics of writing about others from life is something that, these writers do have to engage with, and artists, and, issues of consent. Do you share the work with others before you've written? I actually shared the whole passage about David Cherrington with David before I published it, just out of kind of curiosity to see what he thought. It wasn't that I necessarily was saying anything, but I was hoping for a kind of collaborative exchange with him, and he's someone that I already had a relationship with. But yeah, Sorry, did we get another question coming? But yeah, the ethics of writing about others are fraught and contextual, and I think more and more we're going to see folks maybe taking more of a kind of collaborative approach, or literally like seeking consent, to write about others in certain ways.
Yeah, I also like back to Adrian Piper and her denouncing her African Americanness. Like I think in that show, I'm thinking of someone like Basquiat, who was like, when can I just be an artist? Like, do I always have to embody Black artists like every time, kind of thing, or African American artists? And it's true. Like I think thinking along those lines, like, when can I just be an artist? Like, am I always going to occupy these roles where I fit into the state derived idea of like, okay, it's Asian History Month, or it's Black History Month, or it's this month or that month. Like, yes, I celebrate being a feminist artist or a thinker and a pedagogue and whatnot, but sometimes I just want to be an artist, and sue me. Like, I just, sometimes it is a little bit taken for granted that like the space I take up, I have to somehow part and parcel, or like non-verbally it's known that I'm going to take up this role around equity and inclusion. And I think it's mega unfair that happens, because not all artists have to. There's no equity in that you have to take up the space of, you don't get invited in to be like the white academic, like, it's just like people don't talk like that in your field, right? Whereas like, oh, okay, the last time I was asked to be on a board, I was told that the person needed to curry up her board. And I was like, what? That is not going to get you points for me. Yeah, that is not going to get you points for me to join your board, right? But these are some of my complicated life. It's not very complicated for me, but I'm sharing this out loud, that well, like the mainstream does think like this still in this day and age, and it's unfortunate. Not for me, for everyone involved, you know, because that's work to do. But is it my work to do? Not necessarily, right? And but I'll be there to pat your back and cheer you on.
No, I'm really glad you raised that, Pamela, and thank you for sharing. I'm sorry that happened to you recently with the board talk. But, you know, I do feel like there is a quite ultimately ambivalent relationship that a lot of artists in this book have to even ideas of identity, you know? And so I think that what you're raising, you know, yes, okay, you know, finding agency and you know, knowledge from lived experiences, but then also the ways that, yeah, certain subjects, certain bodies are overdetermined by their gender, by their race, you know, by their sexuality historically. And then it's like, okay, how do we, you know, both with Piper, she thinks a lot about that tension between immanence and transcendence. She's like, you know, like, yeah, like finding, like, yes, embodied, but also her kind of ongoing struggle between that idea of a kind of immanent embodiment and, you know, being marked in certain ways versus a kind of transcendent practice of reflecting on structures of consciousness in a Kantian sense. And, you know, she's written these two like 5,000 page super intense philosophy books on like Kant and Hume, and like I don't know if she would necessarily tie that to any kind of like racial politics. It's Piper's pretty interesting complex case.
Mm-hmm.
I also know we're like at time. I don't know how are we feeling? Are there any other questions or anything else you want to say, Pamela?
I just want to say thank you so much for thinking of me, and I'm looking forward to continuing our dialogue. I feel like we're just getting started around auto theory, autoethnography, but thinking through some of the artists we've been jamming about. And I wish you lots of success. And I hope you all remember that this is available at Type Books. There's 3 Type Book locations in Toronto, by the way, one on Queen West, across from Trinity Bellwoods Park, and then one in the Junction, and then one in Forest Hill. So, you know, if you just happen to be in those areas, then hey, peruse the new, the art section.
Thanks so much, Pamela. I really appreciate it.
I put a link in the chat right at the beginning for people to order online if people are still feeling they don't want to leave their home, or order it online, or if you don't happen to live in Toronto, but you live in other areas, then please click on that.
Lauren, there's one comment or question. Dr. Alice Ming Jim has asked if you would come. What about Montreal? So what about in Montreal?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if any bookstores in Montreal have it. I know like in Ottawa, for example, folks who I know there just like do a special order at whatever your favorite bookstore is. And that's a way, I think most bookstores are typically open to doing that. And then it's a way of them carrying it. So, but I do not know of any places in Montreal yet. That's a great question.
It looks like the Junction location has sold out and they're ordering more.
Hopefully that happens many times, and there'll be lots of more reordering. I kind of wish tonight was the last event of the term, because we started at the beginning with the 50th anniversary of Pierre Guittat's Eden, which is quite a radical difference from this evening, but even that 50-year difference in that book and autofiction conversation is kind of like a really wild, actually acknowledgement of how things have perhaps shifted right along the questions of JP, but it's not. So the last link I'll put in there is the event for next week with Rui Amaral to finish off. So it'd be great if you all would come back next week. Other than that, I want to thank Lauren and also Pamela for a very excellent and very natural, great kind of conversation.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, it was great. All right, everyone, take care, stay safe, and we'll see you next week.
Okay, great. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.